All right, my guest is Dr. Richard Wolff, and he's a economist, a Marxist economist, and he has been involved in the Occupy Wall Street movement. And we want to get an idea from him as to what's happening out there in Wall Street. Why are people in America taking over the financial center of America, the financial center of the world? What is this all about, Rick?
Well, I think it's a little, how shall I say, premature to suggest that these people are taking over anything. But it is clear that after a long delay in which oppositions and resistance to neoliberalism, to capitalism itself, to the austerity policies being introduced to shift the burden of this crisis onto the mass of the people, after those kinds of resistances have happened in most other countries, more or less, and particularly in the European countries, it is really not that surprising that it has come to the United States. We don't have the kinds of long-lasting organizations of the masses that they do in places like Greece or France or Italy and so on. That is, we are now at the low point in a 50-year decline in the membership and strength of our labor movement, our labor unions. We practically don't have any socialist or communist parties as such. They are extremely small and with very minimal influence. That puts us in quite a different situation than, for example, the European countries. We don't even have as strong green parties or anti-capitalist parties as they do. And therefore, you do not have the webs and the nexuses, if I might say so, of organization that could have and probably would have mobilized political resistance and opposition in the United States long ago. So what you're seeing now is the delay. You had to build up more and more resentment, anger, a sense of betrayal that the quote-unquote middle class or the quote-unquote average working people of America feel now that they have really lost not only their well-being and their security, but they've lost the hope that their children will get it either. And I think you're just seeing the delayed response in the form of a sudden welling up, not only of these movements across American cities, but of a groundswell of mass support for what they're doing.
Why are they focusing on Wall Street?
Good question. Wall Street has become in the United States the symbol of all of it. That is, Wall Street has its very high salaries and bonuses as a focus of media attention and therefore of popular anger. Number two, there is a widespread perception that this economic crisis is in some sense a financial crisis. I don't agree with that, but put that aside, that is the perception. And the center of finance is known to be New York, and the symbol of that center is Wall Street. And finally, the last several secretaries of the Treasury in the United States, and in particular, the current Mr. Geithner and his predecessor, Mr. Paulson, both came from probably the most visible symbol of Wall Street, namely the investment bank Goldman Sachs. So you put all those things together, and it has become the symbolic target And that's why it began here.
So who really started the organizing of this Occupy Wall Street movement? How did it come about?
Well, I think you've actually had at least half a dozen efforts over the last 2 years to get people who already agree that what's happening in the economy is intolerable, unjust, undemocratic, and so on. There have been at least 6 efforts to find a symbolic way to gather these people together and begin to make a movement. The only one that gained a significant amount of attention around the country was the movement in Wisconsin earlier this year, when the governor there not only fired public employees and not only took away all kinds of benefits from public employees as a way to cope with the crisis, but attacked their right to collective bargaining, something that those public workers had fought for and won many decades ago, and that no politician since then, Democrat or Republican, had ever threatened or moved against. When Governor Walker in Wisconsin did that, students, union people, and angry citizens mobilized around that, shut down the city of Madison, Wisconsin, which is the home of the capital and of the major university there. But in that case, even though it was quite successful and was very much a mass movement, it was successfully redirected from action in the street to action at the ballot box. The demonstrators were persuaded that they should engage with the Democratic Party in an effort to recall certain Republican politicians in their districts. And this proved ultimately unsuccessful, but more important than the fact that they couldn't succeed in the recall election was the fact that popular action, direct action, radical action was deflected and moved instead into electoral work directed and governed by the Democratic Party on the one hand, and all the laws applying to electoral processes on the other. I think that proved to be a negative but very powerful lesson, and that it determined in the people who mobilized this time not to have that happen again. We'll see whether they will be successful in that, but I think you have here, as I said before, the culmination in which people who have tried a variety of ways of mobilizing opposition hit upon this one, and I can assure you that they and all of us looking on and all of us who participate, as I personally have, are amazed and surprised and wonderfully gratified that the response has been so huge, so overwhelmingly positive in such a short time.
So it's not important that the organizers are hardcore leftists. They're not even trade unionists, but people who are trying to send a message symbolically. Is this what you're trying to say?
Yes, but I wouldn't go quite so far as to say they are not leftists. They include leftists. They include trade unions. They include older people who've had experience in politics and younger people with much less or no experience in politics. It is a very diverse movement. It is governed by no single political commitments. It is very fluid. It is changing all the time. And while the more traditional leftists are distressed by this, by the absence of a clear priority program, by the absence of any clear defined leadership, I would respectfully disagree with those people and believe that there is an instinct operating here about how to begin this movement and to do it without leadership explicitly and with a very great open arms approach to welcoming all kinds of people. And at least so far, that has been stunningly successful.
Well, we are hearing that it's now spread to Chicago and other cities. Washington, what can you tell us about that?
Yes, it is spreading very, very fast. Interestingly, not only to the major cities like LA, San Francisco, Chicago, and Boston, and so on, and Philadelphia, but increasingly to much smaller cities as local people basking, you might say, in the publicity and the mainly positive publicity at this point from everyone in this culture, not just on the left of the center, but even the center.
Well, let us look at the upcoming presidential elections due, let us say, within another year. How will this affect the elections, do you think?
They will affect the elections, that's for sure. The Republicans, or at least the conservative Republicans, have made a decision clearly over the last few days to attack the Occupy Wall Street. They feel a competitive rage that they have been pushed out of the media limelight, that they are being treated by the media as old news, particularly the Tea Party, and they have been very upset by this. And in a sense, I can understand it. The existence of this movement, if it continues, and if it continues to grow, will represent, whatever else happens, a large push in the direction that has so far been silent in the United States. Let me give you some examples. This movement will push much more than anyone else has to tax rich people. It will push harder to tax corporations. It will push harder for a government employment program. It will, in short, be a movement that will embolden and strengthen liberals across the political spectrum. And that means the opposition to what the Tea Party wants, even inside the Republican Party, will become stronger, and that will make the Tea Party more and more marginal, more and more looking even to the people in the Republican Party like something dangerously fringe rather than mainstream.
For example, tax the rich. Is that something that would force the Republicans to take seriously?
No, I think the Republicans are committed to opposing it. What is going to happen, though, is that you're going to see, my guess, this is purely a speculation, but my guess is as the Occupy Wall Street takes a stronger position on taxing the rich, what you'll begin to see is the emergence of a middle ground, which I would expect Obama to take. But it will look like this. Obama will go to the mass of the American people and present himself as a good middle person, a good moderate centrist, but who has to, here comes the new wrinkle, who has to show some support to the left, just as he has over the last 2.5 years shown a willingness to compromise with the right. And he will appeal to the Republicans to see the wisdom in asking and requiring that the richest pay. This will put enormous pressure on Republicans who are not in the Tea Party to support this and to not risk losing elections to Democrats who will expose them as being Tea Party if they do not accept this kind of position. Obama has shifted already in the last 3 weeks into more of a tax the rich position because he already sees that he can do that effectively, even with only 3 or 4 weeks of this phenomenon. And that's partly because the media have changed and made these people quasi-heroes.
Finally, Rick, do you think the people out there in New York and Philadelphia and Chicago and elsewhere are paying attention to what's happening in the Middle East and in North Africa? You think they're being inspired by what's happening there?
Yes, I think that particularly those that pay attention, and again, the United States is a politically quite insular, but I think yes, for those who pay attention, what was seen, the Arab Spring, the general strikes in Europe, the changed politics over the last 2 years across Latin America, all of these things play a role. I think many Americans were frankly embarrassed that with so many courageous, admirable things elsewhere in the world, that we in the United States were so far behind. Let me give you an example of how it also worked. When the New York police badly overreacted in 2 instances, the first time an out-of-control police officer spraying pepper gas at a group of women who were simply standing and threatening no one. The second event happened last weekend when the police directed about 1,000 demonstrators onto the Brooklyn Bridge and then arrested 700 for being on the bridge. This was stupid, excessive, and inappropriate. And here is the interesting thing. It called to mind the images of the police in Egypt, Syria, and other countries using violence to repress the young people trying to bring democracy and progress there. And it made for a major mass public reaction against the police. And they have had to behave much better in the last week than in the first 2. So I think in a number of ways, activities around the world are influencing and shaping the events here. But I want to stress that this time, the American left is not mobilizing around a war far away, like Vietnam. It is not mobilizing around the discrimination and suffering of a minority, for example, African Americans. This time, it is a mass movement that has carefully chosen the slogan, "We are the 99%. We are everyone who isn't super rich, running the government, running the corporations." It is a movement against what the sociologist C. Wright Mills years ago called the power elite. And I think this gives the movement very deep majoritarian roots in the United States in the way that the left has not had